Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and welcome to part 3 of this series, Unlocking the Giza Plateau, the Ancient Science of Astronomy, Geometry and Metrology of the Pyramids. Now what I've found is here on the Giza Plateau there is essentially a 0 point from which all these important measurements, which will lead to archeoastronomy, ancient measure systems, but also some very advanced geometry and mathematics, is embedded in the Giza Plateau. And this can be found actually well beyond the Giza Plateau, and it will link to the lesser known pyramids, but also down to what's called Upper Egypt or Southern Egypt, Upper Egypt because it's up the river, and places such as Abydos and Thebes are embedding this same plan, and also because of a connection to the Nile, the important symbolism of the seasons, both in the real, the living world of ancient Egypt, but also in the ancient texts such as the pyramid texts or the coffin texts or the later Book of the Dead or Coming Forth by Day. What we have is a geometric plan based around archeoastronomy and alignments linked to the all-important flood season or arket. I showed earlier, so if we use the 0 point on the northwest corner of Khafre Valley Temple, we're linking all three of the great pyramids, but also the lesser Fort of Kent-Kawe tomb / pyramid, and beginning with some archeoastronomy, the solstice, the equinoxes, and summer and winter solstice as well. And the midpoints between those will give us lines that lead directly to, for instance, Menkaura's pyramid and the Khafre pyramid, and the distance between these sites, also the distance between the 0 point and the Kent-Kawe tomb, are based on the Great Pyramid itself and on some very sophisticated mathematics, geometry, which is found inside the pyramid, and it is repeated throughout. More to come on that because there's so much to it. So the 0 point, this doorway which leads the causeway angle, already begins in the Khafre Valley Temple. Right above this doorway is the 0 point. Solstice, equinox and solstice, it's a calendar, it's an observatory, but also the plan and the layout itself, multiple levels of information. I'll link part 1 and part 2 in the description. I think it'd be more important to have a grip on where I've already come from, but to understand this part, because it's going to go to some very well measurable, tangible, observable, testable patterns in this geometry, and it's based with an essence in archeoastronomy and solar alignments, marking out a calendar year which describes the life, the rhythm of life of Egypt itself around the Nile. So showed earlier, certainly this is a 0 point, and again there's so much more to come. So it's essentially the Giza Plateau and these other temples are embedding metrology, measuring time, measuring distance through geometry, as it used to say on the Platonic academies, let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door, and that's the language that they're speaking here. So we begin with the 3 seasons, arket or the inundation, peret or emergence when the water would come down, and the growing season will begin, and then the dry season, shemu. But 3 seasons they had, each of 120 days plus a 5-day intercalary period to make out a 365-day calendar. The summer solstice sets from the 0 point, sets directly between the Khafre pyramid and the Great Pyramid, or Khufu's pyramid as it's called. The 120-day of arket, we even see the symbol for arket, the sun going down between the mountains. That's a 120-day season and the beginning of this all-important flood cycle. The winter solstice, which would be marked from the 0 point, from the northwest corner of Kent-Kawe's tomb / pyramid, would mark the winter solstice. So we have a fixed 56-degree angle between those. Now it's important to note that the summer solstice and both the winter appear to set in the same location for 2 to 3 days. Well, it could be 3 sunsets and 2 sunrises, or vice versa. Essentially we're getting 2.5 days of summer solstice, 2.5 days of winter solstice, 5 days, and then we add them together to 360 days. We get our 365-day year. So from the summer solstice, it would take 180 days to the beginning of the winter solstice. Archet lasts for 120 days, so we can simply divide 56 degrees by 2/3, and 120 days would be 37.33 degrees, simply speaking. However, how do we measure the salt? Did they measure from the first day, or the middle, or the last day? So essentially we're looking at a 37-degree angle, somewhere between 37.33 or 36.666 degrees. The Khafre pyramid, originally 274 Egyptian royal cubits high, 411 wide, which gives us a 3 wide to 2 angle. Now this is an important feature because the Osiron down in Abydos has some lovely information which will lead us directly back to the Archet season and especially the geometry of the Khafre pyramid. And we can see that with these patterns, which just like the Khafre Valley Temple, just like the pyramids themselves, there is no writing on these unusual style of temples where it's a barbaric style, where it's just simple blocks and squares. But apart from the Osiron, where we have this geometry, and well, we've been provided with a key. And I'll link it in the description how you can draw these yourselves. And so that's the pattern there, the seed of life, flower of life, fruit of life as it's called. And it's all built on the Vesica Pisces, 2 circles of equal size, the center of the second on the edge of the first. This is an ancient geometric tool. It's how to draw an equilateral triangle, Proposition 1, Book 1 of Euclid's Elements. Well, you use a Vesica Pisces. It's so important in Christian symbolism, as we see there, the mandala, or the vessel of the fish. Vesica stands for the vessel or the bladder of the fish. We can find it in across so many examples. I'm just using, for instance, the Colosseum. It has that pattern in there. Now the Vesica, the mandala itself, the height would be the square root of 3 if the radius of the circle is 1. So again, there's some lovely geometry. The square root of 3 is in there. And the Colosseum of previous videos, I showed that. Even you can use the actual measurements, not just it looks similar. It actually, mathematically speaking, is based on 1 wide to the square root of 3 long. This is also used in cathedral design. So that's the layout of Chartres Cathedral. It is a square root of 3 long, and it is 1 wide. It's the Vesica. I'll link this video as well because with some, if you've seen, surely you've seen the Nautilus shell and that spiral pattern, the golden number, Fibonacci numbers or Lucas numbers, but that spiral. Well, if we begin with a Vesica, we have Khafre's pyramid. If we extend that out, we get to the 5:8 ratio of Menkare's pyramid, and also we get the 7:11 ratio of the Great Pyramid. The inherent geometry of the 3 Giza pyramids begins with the Vesica Pisces and a couple of lines and a couple of circles, and there you have it. I'll link that in the description. So the Vesica, it's 2 circles, the center of the second on the edge of the first, so it's therefore 1, 2, 3 radius wide and 1, 2 high, 3:2 ratio. This is also the perfect fifth in musical theory, also called the Hermetic Constant. Again, so many examples of either the 2:3 ratio or the square root of 3:1 ratio in ancient and modern architecture. It really is a fundamental unit, both of drawing, geometry, and also in architecture. Now, what's nice about that is now we can create the 3-4-5 triangle, the first of the perfect Pythagorean triplets. Pythagorean Theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. It's one of those things we learn in school, but it's what ranks amongst the most important discoveries in all human knowledge. Because from there, that concept of a squared plus b squared equals c squared, every level of science and technology and mathematics, that stands as one of the first and most important and most useful tools that we have. Simply can't underestimate that, how important this is. And again, ancient architecture across the world, Karnak in France, for instance, or stone circles, we will find either the 3-4-5 triangle or the 5-12-13 triangle. That's the next Pythagorean triplet. Very important in every aspect of science. So the angles of those is 53.13 and 36.87, just to round those off. And well, what's interesting about that is that this is 3 wide, 2 high. Khafre's pyramid is 3 wide and 2 high. What we have is Pythagorean Theorem. Now, whether they understood and had proofs for Pythagorean Theorem, this is a very intellectual debate that carries on, but the essence is, well, if they had a proof or not, is that they were applying it so much. We'll see examples of it, that whether they had a mathematical proof of it, well, that is secondary to the fact that they will repeat this across the length and breadth of Egypt in their most important structures, and that the angle of 36.87 is essentially the angle of 120 days of the archeoastronomy season, from the summer solstice, 120 days later. That's 36.7 or 36.87. You could it's an issue of definitions in there. But so the angle of the Khafre pyramid, which describes the movement of archeoastronomy, it's sitting there nicely in the middle of it, is also demonstrating that angle itself. I believe that the angle of the pyramid, whether it's is demonstrating this, and we'll go more into it because there's a whole. It's just sitting there to be seen, and especially from the 0 point is the essence of this. So whether it's 37.33 or 37 or 36.87, these are so close to exactly what it is, and the definition of, do you begin the first day or the second or the final aspect of the solstice? It will be in there somewhere. Unfortunately, we don't have written records of it, but let's go on. Now, everything that is repeated in the Giza complex plan is repeated inside the pyramids as well. And the geometry of the outside of the pyramids will be repeated on the inside, and whatever is expressed, mathematical constants, pi, phi, Euler's number, so many others, is repeated not just in proportion, but is repeated in measurement. They've left us this, so once you understand their unit of measure, then we can verify that the proportions and the measurements come together. This is no accident, and the basis for ancient measure systems across the world just leads us to geometric mathematical knowledge. These are textbooks. The complex itself, as well as the individual pyramids, are textbooks written in stone. And the sheer number of supposed coincidences is just so extra. It literally is putting your head in the sand for those who dispute. It's an ideological issue that they don't want to accept measurable, tangible facts. It's a belief system, essentially. But the King's Chamber. Now, the perimeter of the King's, so much info. This is more than just a square box. It contains so much info, which is also reflected on the outside of a pyramid, both in proportion and in measurement. But the floor has been changed and moved, but so the original archaeologists described a groove going around the outside, so they had 2 heights for the pyramid, one from the top of the paving, but also a slightly extended height from this groove that went around the outside. And that gives us a 3-4-5 triangle, the same geometry of the Khafre pyramid, the same angles of those, which also reflect this all-important season of archeoastronomy. Now, it doesn't just reflect archeoastronomy, the flood season, also represents the Shemu, or the harvest, or the dry season, because 120 days, end of archeoastronomy, 120 days to winter solstice and back again, so that will come back in that time, but then an unbroken movement across the sky of 120 days reflecting this angle once as well. So it's more than just a single season, it's about the wet and the dry season. The 0 point marker where this astronomy comes together is on the northwest corner of the Khafre Valley Temple. We can see this path leading off already lines up with the Khafre Causeway. There we see from a slightly different angle this doorway, and as with Karnak and other sites, the priests would go onto the roof to make their observations. This was a practice which dates back some time. So the 0 point would be in the doorway, but the place to observe it would best be on the roof there. Now what's important is this Khafre Valley Temple has a rather unusual form of architecture where we see these square off blocks. This is very rare. A typical Egyptian temple has columns and writing and all sorts of decoration everywhere, but the Khafre Valley Temple is very rare in that it has this form of architecture. Where we'll also see that is in the Osiron, where the only decoration is the flower of life, which describes a geometry which will allow us to unlock this larger pattern. And that begins with very simple, beautiful geometry of the vesica, which gives us the angles of Khafre's pyramid to start off with. However, there's more to it than these two sites, and we'll go into more because I'll be looking at Heliopolis, and in future episodes I'll be showing a connection, because what's actually happening in these unadorned, undecorated temples is they actually do have writing on them. The pyramids don't have any writing on them. The original stone cases, so there's even photos, before they did the first accurate surveys of the pyramid, the Great Pyramid included, the base was surrounded with pieces of casing stone. These were not carved with any hieroglyphs. Inside there are not any hieroglyphs. Until the pyramids such as Unas and Pepi and Teti later, where we have the pyramid text carved inside, but no pyramid has writing on the outside. But actually they do. Just like the Osiron, just like Khafre Valley Temple, the pyramids have a language written in them, and that language is measurement and geometry. Once you understand the proportions of these particular columns and blocks and their arrangement, you understand the metrology they were using, the Egyptian royal cubit, then we will find that there is a language. And this brutal, simple style, it's just for those with eyes to see, and I think it's going to relate back to the schools of Shesset, who was a goddess of geometry, architecture, building, surveying, mathematics, and astronomy. And what we have here is actually a language embedded, encoded, and it's just for those, as the Platonic academies, let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door. This was how secrets were held in plain sight. We need to understand measurement of length, measurements of time, and the basic inherent rules of very simple geometry, and so much information will come. These unwritten walls have more information than what all the other ones do put together. And it's just written in a pattern, and it's a geometric pattern. Now from the 0 point, we see the Khafre's pyramid in profile, where we get this 3, 4, 5 triangle. However, the Great Pyramid is seen from the corner. This is another very important feature, and now what would happen is that we would see, instead of the slope angle, which is a beautiful angle in regards to pi, phi, and so many others, squaring the circle, very little is spoken of about the corner angles, and that corner angle is 42 degrees. If the pyramid was strict 7-11 proportions, that corner angle would be 41.99. But because there are slight deviations on each side of a pyramid, for instance, this would be the southern face, that's just over 756 feet, and the northern side is 20 centimeters less than that. Now that in itself contains information, extraordinary information, and if we include the deviations in especially the Great Pyramid, we will see that excellent approximates of these important mathematical constants, which are apparently not discovered for 2 to 4,000 years after the accepted date, are actually written in here by the measures, but also by proportions, to remove any element of coincidence, and what is on the outside is repeated on the inside of a pyramid. I must stress that proportion and measurement on the outside, proportion and measurement on the inside, there is zero chance of coincidence. But this 42 degree and 48 degree angle, because that would be 40 degrees on the vertical, this is a pattern which is repeated across Egypt. So summer solstice, the Egyptian New Year, the marking of the all-important flood season, which was the heartbeat of Egyptian life. It was also for the people on the Tigris-Euphrates, so Sumer, Babylon, the Indus people, Vinca and Varna along the Danube, the mounds that are, wherever there are rivers, there are mounds, and that's because since the population explosion and mass irrigation, the rivers don't flow like they used to. Now we've added large dams, so the old flood cycles, which defined the human existence for all of history up until the last 200 years, and even more recent, has been lost. And we need to see the world as it was now, and it's the flooding and the dry seasons of the rivers. It was the rhythm of life, and the solstice and the summer and the winter, this is the rhythm of life still. And in the past, the flooding seasons, you cannot underestimate, and to not include it is just not to understand the nature, the pulsive nature, the rhythm of life at the time. So Arket, the flood season. However, when the summer solstice, when the sun sets, we would actually get this view, because the pyramids would be seen in a silhouette. So this 28 degrees from true west, where the equinoxes will be marked, very important angle. But we also would see the pyramids in that form, where we would see the silhouette, and we would see the Great Pyramid from the corner. Therefore, the 3, 4, 5 triangle, but also this 42, 48 degree angle, and this we'll examine in other parts of Egypt and connections to this. So these are important features to keep in mind. These are the angles we'll be using, and other people who have studied archaeoastronomy have noticed how many of these angles, how often it appears. However, I think I have the explanation for those. Now, the flood season, Arket, New Year's Day, even the symbol for New Year's Day, this is a reference to time in hieroglyphs, and again we see the sun setting between two mountains. The sun setting between two mountains. And of course, previous episode I showed that these were natural mounds before they were turned into pyramids. Okay, so the silhouette, New Arket, the New Year. So from the Giza Plateau, we're going to go now 480 kilometers or 300 miles as the crow flies. Of course, by the river it would be longer because of the bends. And we're going to go to Thebes, or the Theban Necropolis. The Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens is in Thebes. Places such as the Karnak Temple, Luxor Temple, that's where we have least of the surviving obelisks in Egypt. They're focused in this part of the world. Now, this was a very ancient site, but most of what is now the Theban Necropolis is 1500 to 1000 BC, around that period of Ramses, for instance. And, of course, also Tutankhamun's tomb. All these lovely tombs and images we see here in Thebes. But what the priesthood was still carrying on, the old secrets were still carrying on. They weren't building pyramids in that sense, but everything that's in the geometry and the mystery schools was still in existence, and Thebes was one of the most important places. Thebes, of course, is in Upper Egypt, or Southern Egypt, up the river. And we had two relatively distinct cultures. We had Upper Egypt, which was essentially from Lake Moeris southwards. Everything was along the river and desert on either side. Above that we see a marshy land, the Nile Delta, a land of reeds and marshes, and above that it was river bordered by desert on either side. Very similar, but also very different, because the environment shapes these people as well. So as with all of Egypt, Thebes was utterly dependent on the Nile River, just like the Delta and Lake Moeris and Lower Egypt, Northern Egypt. Upper Egypt was, there is no Egypt without the Nile. Egypt is the Nile. That whole culture is built on the Nile. The gods connected to it, the stories, everything is built around it. So we have an aerial view. This is because of the Google Earth, and so they've got a high resolution strip. That's not like actually the water would carry on, but because this particular feature. So the Colossi of Memnon, these are relatively famous, and that's where their location is. And just to illustrate, here's before the Aswan Dam. We see the flood, how important the flood was to Upper Egypt as well. It didn't just rise a few inches, it enveloped the banks. It was a very, very large flood. Now, if a flood was too high, it would be destructive. If it was too low, it could lead to starvation and famine. It was the pulse of Egyptian life. They entirely depend on the Nile, and they entirely depend on the flood because it would bring silt, mud, and nutrients to lift up the banks. Water's great, but water on sand, you're not growing anything. The nutrients that this flood cycle build as well, that's the essence of Egypt. So, using that as the base, so the Colossi, this is how far the flood would extend again. It's a different landscape. The flood season, this yearly event, not just in Egypt, but all the ancient civilizations based on rivers. This is the transformation that would happen for them. And so I've left these because Karnak and Luxor and these other temples had walls built around them. So just as with Heliopolis, as we'll see, but that's 4 kilometers and 2.5 miles inland is how far it's extending. So you want to know that the flood's coming as well, because you can live on the river rest of the year, but when this comes, whatever possessions, what you have, or your very life itself is going to be lost. So when the flood comes, very important, but also being prepared ahead of time. And so there we have, again, so you can see the walls just inside the yellow line, where these temple complexes had, again, large perimeter walls. Even pyramids have these perimeter walls because of the flood, to preserve and to allow the priesthood to keep on practicing even during the height of the flood. Also, we give these sites a mystical element, because they exist there while the people living on smaller houses or encamped on the river have to move during that time. Also represents the benben or mount. So the benben, which arise from the waters, are stone. But again, summer solstice, the new year, just it applies in upper Egypt just like in lower Egypt, and the archetype symbolism of the Great Pyramids. Egypt is the Nile, the river is the spine, and the flood, the cycle of the seasons, is the heartbeat. This has been unfortunately lost, because especially even just since the 1970s and recent dam projects on the Tigris-Euphrates, irrigation on the Indus, the Danube, we've forgotten and don't really appreciate the importance of the ebb and flow of the river during the year. So Thebes, we're now going to examine Thebes, the major temples there, and see that the plan at Giza is actually embedded here in Thebes as well. The ancient writer Strabo wrote about Thebes during his travels. He travelled through Babylon, but also Egypt. Very interesting Strabo geography to read. But he speaks of Thebes, and an important feature. The priests there are said to have been, for the most part, astronomers and philosophers. Now, philosophy is wisdom, the love of wisdom, and science we would really refer to astronomers and philosophers, just like in Heliopolis. It is due to these priests also that people reckon the days, not by the moon. So a lunar year is, every full moon is a month, and so it works out 354 days per lunar year. Islam, China, the Jewish calendar, traditionally still based on the lunar year, but the solar year of 365.25 days. So reckon the days not by the moon, but by the sun, adding to the 12 months of 30 days, each 5 days each year, and then filling out the whole of the year. So 30 times 12 is 360, then another 5 days to bring to 365. Since a fraction of the day runs over and above a form of period of time from enough whole days or whole years to make the fractions that run over and above, when added together, amount to a day. They attribute to Hermes, Thoth, the female counterpart was Sheshet. Sheshet invented writing and taught it to Thoth, who taught it to humanity. They attribute to Hermes all the wisdom of this particular kind. Hermes and Sheshet were the gods connected to science, astronomy, writing, geometry, construction, everything that we would think of as scholarly, academic, relates directly to them. But also he points out that there was a fraction that run over and above, then added together amount to a day. He's describing 365.2 or 0.242 days, the leap year. Now this is very controversial, whether they had 365 1/4 or just 365. But however, Diodorus Siculus describes the Egyptians using a 365 1/4 day calendar. Also the Ramesseum, so that's where the Ramesseum is. Also he refers to there was a golden circle with a circumference of 365 cubits at the Ramesseum, which they refer to as the tomb of Ozymandias. But I'm not highlighting the Ramesseum here. That's the Ramesseum, but we will come back to it. So in case you're going, well, why isn't Ramesseum included? We will be looking at this. But the major sites here in Thebes is the Temple of Karnak, Temple of Luxor, the Colossi of Memnon and the associated avenue, Daryl Medina, Medinet Habu, which are Ramesses and these large complexes. Also Deir el-Bahiri, which is very, very important as well. But of course the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens is very important. It's the Theban Necropolis, as it's called. So this complex served these graveyards for the kings and queens in a very similar way that right next to the Giza pyramids we have, and all around them we have these necropolis sites, tombs and graveyards connected to the pyramids themselves. But let's begin. The Temple of Karnak, there's an aerial view. It's well known that it's aligned to the summer solstice, which is the beginning of the flood season of Arket that marks the Egyptian New Year. So it's 28 degrees north of true west, just like from the 0 point to the summer solstice between Khafre and the Great Pyramid. The flood is very important, of course, and we can see when the walls and the doors weren't maintained, the Great Flood would come in and the water level is relatively low, but you can even see a hint of the high water mark here on these columns. And that's important because the walls once surrounding it preserved as a protection against the annual flood waters, and you can see what damage has been done. So these columns, you can see the watermark and the damage line. Now, also worth noting that these were plastered. This is not carved into the stone. This was not much spoken of, but the Egyptians weren't just always carving directly into the stone. They were also applying this plaster cement, which for all appearances looks to be stone. However, once the water and the salt gets to it, it strips it off. So this type of pattern of erosion wouldn't happen from just stone flaking off. Karnak is also pointing to the Valley of the Kings, and I would believe it's pointing to a specific tomb, probably in the Valley of the Kings, but this is a feature, we'll leave that to the moment. Now, Deir el-Bahiri, which is where the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut and others were, that's the temple now. A lot of restoration work, of course, has been done to this site. There we would see the steps and the temple entrance itself, again pointing to the Valley of the Kings at 28 degrees, marking the solstice. And so if you would stand coming up the main avenue, up the steps, down to the door, the sun would set on the summer solstice right along this crack. So just like the Giza complex was built on natural positions, and also you can see the same in the stone circles in England and even other sites where it's not just the temple or the structure has been aligned to the solstice. They'll tend to use a geographic position. So they'll use a space between two hills, and that site will then be chosen and aligned because it matches the geography as well. And so this is again a common feature. So now the Colossi of Memnon. These are the Colossi of Memnon. That's where their actual location is, and it's part of a larger construct where we have along the avenue. You can even see if these statues were on their own, they would be quite impressive, but because they're in front of the Colossi, they don't look as big. But again, you can get an idea, even over people a little bit closer to the camera, just how large they are. So if someone's standing right at the base, basically you have to put your arm up to touch the base of these colossal statues. There we see, again, in the floodwaters. Strabo again speaks of these. There are several temples, but most of these too were mutilated by Cambyses. Now it is only a collection of villages, part of it being in Arabia. Cambyses was a Persian king who invaded Egypt and did a lot of destruction. Unlike other conquerors, foreign rulers who tended to embrace Egyptian culture and do everything very Egyptian and add to the buildings, Alexander, for instance, and other foreign peoples, Cambyses famously destroyed Heliopolis too, as well. But it's also in Strabo, he says he destroyed the obelisks of Heliopolis by iron and fire. And so the damage patterns, so okay, before I go on, the Colossi of Memnon, here are two colossi which are near one another and are each made of a single stone. One of them is preserved, but the upper parts of the other, from the seat up, fell when an earthquake took place, so it is said. However, just like Strabo describes Heliopolis, the obelisks and the temples being destroyed by iron and fire, okay, that damage, this is the one which survives intact. This was not done by an earthquake. This was done by fire. So people still do this now if they don't have access to modern machines. If you've got a massive boulder, you set a big fire around the boulder and you let it burn and you let the stone heat up and then you throw water on it and it destroys the stone. And that's an ancient stoneworking technique, and you'll see it in other sites. The Roman columns at Baalbek, for instance, this is the same pattern. There's some fanciful explanations for that type of stone pattern, but this is how stone was worked. Fire, throw water on it, and it shatters the stone. If you live in a cold environment, once in the middle of winter I need to get the ice off my windscreen, I put warm water on it, well, bang, where went my windscreen? So that's how it works. This colossi, which was completely damaged from the seat up, this is part of a Roman era restoration. So these blocks were put back together during the Roman era. Again, the avenue on which the colossi is 28 degrees. So if you stand in the middle on the summer solstice, the sun's going to set right in the middle of this avenue, marking the new year, marking the beginning of the flood season. It's also, now that points to the Valley of the Queens, and it is probably to, again, I would say, probably to a certain temple tomb within the Valley of the Queens. So here we start to see a pattern emerging in the larger Theban complex, but also linked to the Giza layout. Now that's not all, of course. So Archet, observed from the 0 point, we see the silhouette of Khafre pyramid and we see the silhouette of the Great Pyramid. From that we get a certain set of proportions and angles, 42, 48 degrees and 53.13 or 36.87 degrees, 3, 4, 5 triangles. Now let's go to Luxor. Another one of these very important tourist sites, one of the more impressive temples. This obelisk was moved to Paris, now in the Place de la Concorde. We also have a massive avenue of sphinxes linking Luxor to Karnak. Now just at the front, like on the left-hand side of this statue on the entrance, we see these, where the stone was cracked and these positions for these ties were put in place to do repair work. Now that's the Nile god Happy. It's hard to make out, but he's got a big belly, and that's to represent the wealth and health given by the Nile. But you might have seen these, and well, there's what you won't see, what they won't show you for the most part is that, so that's where those gaps are, those stone tie gaps. Well, just behind this obelisk, like literally you turn around and not too many footsteps away, we can see where the stone is being, and a stone tie is being put in place. It's still in place there now, and for some reason it's not, even though it's like, just turn around and there it is. So these were stone ties. There could have been metal ties, clamps used, however, because stone and metal expand and contract, so in the desert it gets very cold at night, and in the day it gets very hot. If you have metal in there, it's going to expand and contract at different rates, and it's going to do more damage than what it's going to actually repair. So what you would have a stone tie, not a metal tie. Inside Luxor, again, we have these seated colossal statues. Well, on the back plate of that particular one, we see Shesset, and there's a secret, lovely astronomical secret in plain sight here. But notice she's holding a pen at a certain angle. Thoth will always hold it at a slighter angle, but she's behind these. She's the goddess of architecture, geometry, astronomy, mathematics, accounting, writing. Her name translates to she who scribes. She invented writing, she taught it to Thoth, Thoth taught it to humanity. She's been largely lost and forgotten and ignored for the most part, but she's my favourite of these gods. So Luxor, now the alignment itself, now I must point out, I was using 36.87. I made that alignment, and then I compare it, and you see that it does follow. So the precise alignment of it is, even with the best equipment, is very, very difficult to get it to within this fraction of a degree. So I'm just declaring the fact that I used these angles because they follow so closely, and it does follow. Now precise is, no one can really do it because there's all sorts of issues. If the stone's been chipped a little bit, or then you'd make an alignment, but it is this angle essentially. So it's 37 degrees plus or minus a small fraction of a degree. Again, please check these things. You can do it on Google Earth and check these angles. So I'm showing the screenshot, and I won't do it for every photo, but that's the angle I'm using. I've just highlighted it there. So, well, that's the Khafre pyramid angle, 3, 4, 5 triangles linked to the flood. Okay, so that's literally follows that. Okay, what can you say now? But again, that's the angle of 120 days that marks not only the flood season but also the dry season, when the sun would return to the summer solstice to end the year. Now you might notice there's a change in angle here in Luxor, and well, that's pointing back to Karnak temple. So there we see the main angle, then it's tilted, and what it's doing is running along this avenue of sphinxes, very, very long, and it's pointing to a position in Karnak temple there. Now, but you notice the red line terminates, it turns, and then it goes north again, and it enters at this doorway. It does not run dead straight. It does now. What are we going to find? We're going to find a solstice alignment there once more. So although the avenue of sphinxes leading out of the offset from Luxor points to Karnak, the avenue makes these two turns before entering. And what's the angle? Again, please check for yourself. It's 28 degrees, just like the summer. So 28 degrees north of true west, pointing to the sunset of the beginning of the flood season as well. Now you could also apply that to the opposite angle, so the winter solstice sunrise, but I'm just focusing on the summer solstice sunset. And again, it points to the Valley of the Kings, probably to a position. So even though Luxor itself is not, well, the cross section it would, but the Sphinx Avenue has it in there as well. And of course it is at this all-important angle, which describes the 120 days between summer solstice and the end of the flood season, or in return, the beginning of the dry season back to the New Year's Day on the summer solstice. And so we can mark that as well. Next we have Medinet Habu, Mortuary Temple of Ramses III, where the famous illustration of the defeat of the Sea Peoples is. It too is pointed to the Valley of the Queens, again probably to a specific location in there, so it matches the other sites as well. Now it's worth noting that the main axis, we have a courtyard, a part of the complex, which is tilted. It's off the main axis, and 53.13 degrees. Again, I use that specific angle. However, it does match. Please check it matches the walls. You can use different because of again, to be absolutely micro precision precise is impossible. Even those people on the ground with the best instruments cannot achieve this level. However, we start to see, by taking multiple examples and seeing there is a pattern that is evident. Now the solstice alignments or pointing to the valleys of the kings and the queens, not so controversial, but the importance of Archet and the flood and this geometry and mathematics, archeoastronomy in there, well, there has been some great work done. It's becoming more and more acceptable. Still, there's a reluctance to accept these things because, to be brutally honest, most of the archaeologists come from the humanities and they don't have a basis in science, and so math, geometry, astronomy, sort of they just their eyes water over. But anyway, 53, 345 triangle, again 36.87 north of true east. That's the angle of the Khafre pyramid, and again the 120 days of those seasons. So we see that here as well. Now what about 42 and 48 of the Great Pyramid, which is from the 0 point is what you see of the Great Pyramid. Well, so this wall 42 degrees from north, or the cross 48 degrees from north, 42, 48 degrees, there you go. Of course we have the 3, 4, 5 triangle, so we have the pattern. Next we have Daryl Medina. Now this is an important site because it's not a grand temple complex, but it's aligned to the Valley of the Kings. So that's Daryl Medina was a village for the craftsmen who worked on the valleys of the kings and the queens. It was essentially a secret, sacred site in that it was separated from the surrounding communities. Workers had special privileges. People needed essentially special permission to come and visit their relatives who might have worked there. And you can see it was a large village town with all the craftsmen worked there, and there we see the major temple complex. Now it's all interesting for so many reasons that craftsmen had many special privileges, including lots and lots of times off, which allowed them to make their own tombs. So these are some examples of the tombs made by the workers on their time off. They had all sorts of privileges. Time off included supervising their wives during the making of a beer. Now the mistress of a house, it was her special role to make the beer, but the workers were given time off to make sure, to supervise. They were giving time off for drinking the beer, and they were giving time off for hangovers as well. The wives of the craftsmen also had special privileges, including servants to help them with child rearing, etc. And famously, the workers here went on strike and they demanded that the king or the vizier come and address their grievances. And when the local chieftains supported the king, they kicked him out as their representative and chose their own representative. These people, they were skilled craftsmen. They knew the secrets of making colours and dyes, stonemasonry, metalwork. Also because they had to make these for the kings and the nobles, they knew all the secret rites. So to make and to decorate these tombs properly, they had to know how to do it. They also knew the secrets of how the kings and queens, the valleys of the kings and queens was guarded. And so when it come time, around 1000 BC, when it all sort of collapsed in that region, they were best positioned to be the tomb robbers since they made the tombs, or their grandfathers made the tombs. They knew where the booby traps were, or in which case where the booby traps were not, because they made them. So they knew how to get in, they knew what was there. Very special, and essentially it's a professional class, the highly skilled tradesmen, stonemasons, metal workers, and now this is one of the tombs, and of course that is the marsh of reeds, or the field of reeds, which describes the Egyptian afterlife, which is very easily to confuse with a description of the Egyptian life, which is the flood, the growing season, and the harvest season. It's also worth noting this particular one because the opening of the mouth ceremony, which mentions Mesketu, the North Star, we see that this instrument, so there were similar ones found in these mortuary temple complexes, where the tool used for the opening the mouth, which talks about constellations, actually reflects the shape of that particular constellation. So these items, which are just called religious, purely religious items, again carry information in there that can be read. Now, Daryl Medina, now the main it's Temple of Hathor, I do believe. Well, again, what's the angle of a wall? No surprises. It's matching Khafre's pyramid again, the 3-4-5 triangle, geometric, astronomical, the calendar season. So we see that the larger complex reflects consistently this particular type of pattern, which matches the flood cycle and the architecture of the Giza complex itself. And these important angles, I'll get more into it in the future, but what we have here is it's not just a reflection of the summer solstice from the 0 point. These particular angles carry very, very important geometrical, mathematical information, which is reinforced throughout the Giza complex itself, and actually links to all the other, the Red Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, Pepi 1 and 2, Menenenre, Usakaf, and all these other lesser known pyramids, unfinished, dismantled pyramids. There's information in here, and it's a consistent pattern. So summer solstice, the new year, the flood, it is throughout the Theban necropolis complex itself. The new year, that symbol, the flood, the Nile, the rhythm of life there. Now next we have another important site, and that is at Abydos. Now here we see the Osiron I mentioned earlier, that has that unique form of architecture. And next, and then we have the Temple of Seti the First, which has this king's list, so much information. This will be in future. There are references to Shesset here as well, just extraordinary, hidden in plain sight, unbelievable information. And it can be accessed through the archeoastronomy, geometry, metrology, and so forth. Well, both the Osiron and Seti are aligned at the same angle. Again. Now what's interesting is that, on a side note, that the equinox runs along from the 0 point, connected to Khafre's pyramid. The famous pyramid of Kukulkan, there we have on the equinox. This shadow is formed, the serpent appears only on the equinox. So these steps are at 45 degrees, and these terraced steps create that shadow. If you look at it from the front, so on the side, 45 degrees, think a compass and square. Well, what's the terrace stepped angles? They're at 53 degrees. Again, matching. Yes, okay, so the Theban complex, it is embedded with this. We also saw it at Abydos, and we're going to see it in other places as well. Beginning with the Giza Plateau and the famous pyramids, they all exist on the Nile. Egypt is the Nile. It is the spine of the civilization. The flood was the heartbeat, and in their legends, in their text, but most importantly in their architecture, this has been placed in high regard, but it also leads to so much other interesting detailed connections of speaking of a very sophisticated, very advanced civilization, as if building the pyramids was not enough. But we'll see that even later generations, the Middle and Late Kingdom, for instance, that they were retaining and passing on is very important knowledge, which is more than just the solstice alignment and the flood. It will lead to very profound scientific information, to textbooks in stone. So from the Giza Plateau to Abydos and to Thebes, we will see the same things emerging, and I'll examine this again in more detail in future episodes. I'm still really just laying the groundwork, just to point out that firstly there clearly is this hidden in plain sight pattern. It's in Abydos, it's all across Thebes, and it's based on, or chicken or the egg, I'm not sure which came first. I would suggest it was the pyramids via Heliopolis, but these angles and the natural cycles upon which they detail, and the architecture upon which reinforces this, is explicit, and it's clear, and it's measurable, and it's testable to a level of precision that in any other field would be well within all acceptable margins of error. Of course, there's as so often is the case with history, there's so many elements attached to it. Dogmas emerge, things get institutionalized, and well, that's just human nature, unfortunately. But the information, and from this 0 point at the northwest corner of Khafre Valley Temple, will link much more, and again, more future episodes. This is really just setting the scene before we go into the very detailed, very astonishing series of connections. I've split this episode up. I don't want to run them, make each one last too long. So thank you for watching. The next part will be up very shortly after this. Please like, share, comment as you wish, and if you would like to support this, would be very grateful. Please visit the PayPal account, SGD Sacred Geometry. That is the account set up for this channel. Small or large contributions very much appreciated and very much helped with this ongoing series and others to throw some light on these elements which are just simply not covered elsewhere. It's a compilation of existing research, but the majority of it is simply you will not find anywhere else. So thank you very much, and have a good one. Next upload will be up very soon.